Everyone, my name is Bogers and I am presenting today on the effects of the Sustainable Development Goals on global governance architectures. It is my first time ever recording a presentation, so let's see how this goes. Alright, so this is work I did together with my PhD supervisors, Biermann, Agni, Kalfagianni and Rakhyun. And first, very shortly about me. I am a PhD candidate at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University, and I am part of the Global Goals research project. And this project investigates the steering effects of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is led by Biermann, and if you're interested, you can go to our website, globalgoalsproject.eu. And as for myself, I would consider myself interdisciplinary. I started off in biomedical sciences, went to innovation sciences, and now I am in global sustainability governance. And my network science was acquired by trial and error. So, for the topic, the point of departure is that international institutions exist and interact with each other. So they form this complex web of international institutions, and this has been called network or an architecture. But within this system there is fragmentation, and this can be defined as the extent to which the world consists of distinct clusters. And fragmentation exists especially between different policy domains. And because of this fragmentation, governance systems have been described as patchworks, spaghetti balls, or mazes. Now, this is problematic because too much fragmentation can hamper governance, because without coordination or collaboration across subgroups, there will be a lack of coherence in policies. And also, if there's different norms, especially norms that conflict, this may obstruct the formation of a shared common vision. And I put too much in between quotes because it's not really clear what too much is or what normal fragmentation is, so this is still something that's up for discussion, but generally people do say fragmentation, if it's too much, it's not a good thing. So, the Sustainable Development Goals, what our whole research project is about. For the ones who don't know, these are the 17 global goals that were adopted by the United Nations in September 2015, and they're supposed to be a set of goals that the entire world can strive to, and as an agenda they reflect the economic, social and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. So they're sort of very broad, all-encompassing goals. Now the idea is that these SDGs can form this common vision that is shared across all governance actors across the globe. So there are these overarching cross-cutting norms that are supposed to bring institutions together. And shared goals are supposed to increase collaboration. So my question was, can the SDG indeed do that? Can they bring institutions together? In other words, reduce fragmentation. And my focus is on international organizations, and I measure fragmentation using network analysis. So very quickly, the hypotheses. The idea is that the network of international organizations becomes less fragmented after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I assess this overall with an existing framework of network measures. And I assess this between the different policy domains, or the different SDGs, and between the economic, social, environmental dimensions of development. So the method, well, clearly network analysis, using international organizations as nodes and connections between them as ties. I look at the time period 2012 to 2019, and I assess one network per year, and I have a total of 276 international organizations. And this is based on a few existing sets, like the Correlates of War dataset, the United Nations System Chart, and the custodian organizations of different SDG indicators. So these are international organizations that have been given the job of collecting data on specific indicators for the SDGs. So I manually assigned SDGs and an economic, social, and or environmental dimension to each international organization. So now, how to create the network? So in this study I use a network of websites and the hyperlinks between them as ties. And this has been done before and is considered a proxy for observing the structure of the underlying interorganizational networks. It hasn't been applied very much within international governance, but there's a few cases. And then because I want to do this study retrospectively from 2012 to 2019, I collected old websites from the Internet Archive, and I try to get all available unique web pages. So that's to say, if there's a homepage archived 20 times in a year, I only get it once. And I try to get these unique websites for each website, so fao.org, un.org, in each year. Now, the data. So there's a high variability in the number of web pages stored per website in the Internet Archive. And this has two reasons. One is that the actual websites have been larger or smaller. So the UN clearly has a much bigger website than a much smaller international organization. But it also is a bias in the Internet Archive that not everything was stored. So the minimum pages that I wanted of a website to include it in analysis was 3. And 43 websites did not have this in 3 or more years, so I deleted those entirely from the analysis. And for the remaining 276 websites, I have just under 3 million web pages collected for all years. And the mean number of pages per website per year is 1340 with a standard deviation of 28 to 22. If you would plot this in a histogram, it's very heavily left skewed, so there's a bigger proportion that is a lot less than more. So then how to deal with these hyperlinks. So for each pair of organizational websites I and J in year Y, I calculate sort of the relative hyperlink strength. So just basically count the number of hyperlinks that goes from website I to website J, divide this by the number of web pages that was collected from the archive for organization I. So to make sure that we don't have just to make sure we get the relative size. So if there's a website for which many pages were collected, but there's only a few links, then in the end that's filtered out. So if the relative hyperlinks is less than 0.001, so 1 hyperlink per 1,000 pages, the tie is removed from the set, so it's considered not a connection. And then I remove the weights for any further analysis. So what does the network look like? It's star-shaped, and the top 10 actors by in degree. I checked in degree because of the nature of hyperlinks. It varies some, but it's all the usual suspects in the top 10. So it's European Union, United Nations, World Bank, FAO, UNESCO. So no surprise there, which is good, because then we know at least it's somewhat working. And this is what it looks like. I removed the isolates here, so it's very much just a big cluster in the middle with some spikes to the sides. Now, a bit on the descriptives. So I haven't done any advanced statistical models yet, only descriptives. So as you can see here, this is the years. And then here we have the number of international organizations, which is kept the same, the number of edges for each year. So again, this is made binary, so the weights have not been included in this. And here at the arrow, so this is the official implementation of the SDGs, so they officially started on January 1st, 2016. And then I've plotted a few network measures, and these actually come from a paper by Kim in 2019, my co-author, and he consolidated some previous work on fragmentation and came up with this set of measures to assess fragmentation, so I used those. So just to go over them one by one, we have density, and for this measure it's the case that if there's an increase, we consider it a sign of less fragmentation. And again, my hypothesis was that there would be less fragmentation after the SDGs were introduced. So we can see in 2012, 2013, stable, goes up a bit, so less fragmentation, but down again. And actually it's pretty stable, but except that it's quite low in 2018 and 2019. So I would consider this a sign of more fragmentation. Then the fraction of giant components. Again, the larger this is, the less fragmentation. So here we see an increase, so stabilization and more increase, and again a drop in 2018 and 2019. Then the path length, here it's the other way around, so if the average path length increases, this would be a sign of increasing fragmentation. But here we don't really see a clear pattern, so not really sure what's happening there, still a lot of interpretation to do. Then modularity, so this is Louvain modularity. And a higher number is supposed to say more modularity, so also more fragmentation. And again, this varies a bit, not really a clear pattern. And lastly, we have closeness centralization, and in this case, we see again somewhat of a varying pattern, so also not really clear. So still a lot that is a bit unclear, but from these two measures, we do see that there seems to be actually more fragmentation in 2018 and 2019. So if we then look at the the hypothesis that it was supposed to be less fragmentation overall after the SDG were implemented. We can't say this is true because there seems to be more fragmentation in 2018-2019. Just bear in mind, this is all very preliminary. Then we go to the hypothesis 2 and 3. And for now, I have assessed those quite simply by looking at the ties that exist, so only the ties that exist. And whenever a tie exists, I assess whether the international organizations that it connects are working on the same SDG or on a different SDG. And if they're working on at least one the same SDG, this is a within SDG tie. And if they're working on different SDGs, this is an across SDG tie. And I do the same thing for the dimensions. And this is based on the manual coding of each international organization to SDG and a dimension. So here you see the percentages of within SDG ties and within dimension ties as a percentage of the total number of existing ties in a year. And both show, well, an increase, a clear increase in number. So what this says is that out of all ties that exist in the network, there's increasingly more that are happening between organizations that are working on the same SDG or working on the same dimension of development. So again, if we look at the hypothesis that there was supposed to be less fragmentation across policy domains, we actually see the opposite effect. We see sort of an increase of ties occurring between organizations working on the same SDG in the same dimension. So this would, in essence, be a form of siloization. So sort of the organizations that are there working on certain topics are drawing towards each other rather than towards other international organizations in other policy domains. And this was the opposite of what I hypothesized. So the question is, what could be the cause? So it's not completely unexpected because there's a few authors who wrote about the possibility of this happening. So for example, Fukuda did a study on the Millennium Development Goals, so the predecessor of the SDGs. And she wrote that the goals targets really encourage implementation approaches that are conceptually narrow and vertically structured. So in essence, by using goals and targets, actors quickly focus on the ones that are sort of easy to achieve and that suit their bill, and so they just sort of not really pay attention to other sectors anymore as much. Then another cause could be that there's no clear prioritization in the SDGs. They have been criticized for this, so it's up to actors to sort of determine what they find important and what they want to work on first. So this has led, at least at the country level, to look at politically salient issues and targets that are relatively easy to achieve. So again, there would be less attention for really looking at other sectors or interdependencies with other sectors. Then another study by Ellen was also on the lack of knowledge on interdependency. So it's quite hard to determine what kind of effect your policy will have on other sectors. So if I'm working on food, what effect does it have on water or energy or poverty? And some of these connections are really well known and others are not. And often organizations really lack the technical know-how to really dive into this. So there's not really any attention for it. And lastly, it has been written that especially at the level of international institutions, that because some targets and goals already fall on their existing mandates, there might be a resistance to really look further than their own goals. So in essence, international organizations keep doing what they're doing, and they're not really paying that much attention to this focus on the idea that everything is interlinked. So nothing's changed, basically. That would be the pessimistic conclusion. So this is it for now, what I have, and some questions that I still have that I could ask to you as audience of this Political Networks conference. So one thing, of course, that I really struggle with is, can you really causally tie anything to the SDGs? Because we don't really have a counterfactual. There's no set of international organizations that have not been exposed to the SDGs. So is this then impossible? Looking at before and after, what I'm doing now is a proxy, but it's not great. So is there a way to get around this? Of course, there's triangulation with qualitative research, which is what my colleague PhDs are doing. But still, if there's anyone who has ideas on this, I would love to hear. So secondly, I am now looking to applying also a stochastic actor-oriented model to this data. I haven't done so yet, and also I've never used that before. So I was just wondering if anyone has feedback on that, like would this be suitable? Would it fit the question and the data? And lastly, I think one of the big things is, okay, so we see some small changes, but are these really significant changes, or is it just noise? How can we be sure? And in this way, I would also request anyone who's working on this idea of detecting significant network change, is there a way to look at this and say, okay, so this network really is a lot different than previously, and this is really not noise, but actual real-world things that we are seeing. So that's it. Thank you for the attention, and looking forward to the Q&A.